welcome on stage Charles Hoskinson. Welcome, Charles. Quickly, where is this giraffe and how is the giraffe doing?
It's in Johannesburg. We call him Chips because he likes potato chips.
And you have a plan to bring the giraffe over to the States?
It's easy to get out of South Africa, but apparently owning one in Colorado is hard. And I have a farm to put him on, but it's not exactly the right climate, so we got to figure that out.
If you want to talk more about giraffes with Charles, talk to him afterwards. Okay, up next
for giraffe hours at 9 o'clock.
Okay, giraffe hours 9 o'clock. So the next gentleman I can introduce to stage to have this fireside chat with Charles, he is the general counsel of Concordium, which is a Swiss foundation working with universities in Denmark and Switzerland on the technological and scientific aspects of building the blockchain. Welcome on stage, Henrik Sanders, general counsel of Concordium.
Woo!
The stage is yours. Welcome, Henrik.
Good to see you, Henrik.
Mic's working?
Hope so. Can you guys hear us? Yes. All right. He's Danish. You can always hear him.
All right, Charles. So we kind of agreed that I would ask you a couple of questions.
Yeah.
And the first question, this one's off, right? Is it working? Yeah. So the first question I think a lot of people are wondering is how's Cardano doing these days? What's the blockchain doing? Is it being developed?
You know, if you ever want to sleep like a baby, you know, like wake up every 2 hours and cry, build a blockchain. It's a fun thing to do. No, actually, the project is on schedule for release soon for the Shelley mainnet, and soon after smart contracts. It's been a long 5 years, but we're now actually starting to see many things come out. We've written 55 papers, a lot of peer-reviewed. It's been an unbelievable amount of work, but it's so exciting that we actually get to move from the lab to engineering to commercialization, and we're now in a really good position to start solving some real-life problems at scale of millions to billions of people. So it's quite humbling from one perspective and exhausting from another perspective. This is why I collect exotic animals. They make me feel good about life.
So at Concordium, we're building a blockchain as well, so I think we do share some of the views on that. It's not that easy.
It's not.
Takes time, but we'll get there.
Yeah.
All right. So the topic for this Fireside Chat is integrated KYC and AML in industry-grade blockchains.
It's a hell of a topic.
That's a hell of a topic. But I think KYC and AML is kind of an interesting topic, right? So what's Cardano's view on integrating KYC in the blockchain or off-chain?
So it's a fundamental question of how much regulation do you want to put into your blockchain? And you know, you can take the Bitcoin view of saying, hey, it's just going to push transactions around. They're pseudonymous. Things like identity, things like automation, contracts, those things, oh, well, we're not going to deal with that. Some sort of layer 2 solution, some sort of meta thing to the chain will deal with that. And then you look at other systems where they try to actually bake compliance into the ledger itself, and then they naturally have questions of, well, which ledger, what compliance standard do you comply with? So what we do is we take a step back and we say, look at the transaction itself. And there are 5 properties to a transaction. First, it carries an asset. An asset can be anything. It can be a security token, it can be a commodity, it can be land, it can be intellectual property, it could be airline miles. Okay, you can get very abstract with that. But it's some instrument of value that somebody values and that you can quantify, either fungible or non-fungible, regulated or unregulated. Then you have identity. And identity is basically usually the parties involved. There's a one-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-one, many-to-many, these types of patterns. But basically, who's doing these things? Then you have metadata, which is the story of the transaction. Where did you withdraw the money? When did that happen? Which parties are involved and in the timestamp, these things, okay? So basically, all the stuff around that transaction that would be relevant to the transaction. And then you have the contractual terms. So those are things like, is it reversible? Can you get a refund? Can the government get involved? Are you going to arbitrate? Blah, blah, blah. So we usually call that a smart contract in our space. And then finally, transactions don't live in vacuums. They live in a regulatory environment, right? United States to Europe or something. So every transaction is connected generally to some collection of laws. So when you look at it from that perspective, then you can start actually saying, okay, what do I have to do to the addresses, addresses and embed within the transaction between the addresses that can be useful for regulated entities to do business with each other. Either go, no go, i.e. will this transaction settle or not settle? And then second, how can I unwind things retroactively for certain parties so that those parties can know what's going on? So then we had to ask ourselves, well, how do you do that but still preserve a Bitcoin-esque level of privacy and usability? So usually you do that by embedding things, and you can embed two things in a transaction, and those things can allow you to kind of have your cake and eat it too. First, a DID. So a DID is a decentralized identifier. It's basically just a string of bits, and it links to a document. It's almost like a URL to a website. And that can contain arbitrary amounts of data about who a person is. And you can encrypt that or leave it unencrypted. But it's very easy to embed that into a transaction because it's quite small, and how you authenticate it and how you revoke it and how you either encrypt it or not, that can be meta to this whole scheme. Second, you embed hashes, and usually those hashes are connected to some concept. The easiest thing is compliance. So you'd say something like, oh, I'm an exchange, and I'm not going to let you send me money unless you put a compliance hash in, and that hash comes from, let's say, Identity Mind. And the pre-image of it is some form you filled out that was authenticated by them, and they signed it. So if you put those two things into a transaction, it turns out those are so powerful that you can actually reconstruct most of the US and European regulatory standards, if not all. And there's always some solution there. So for example, let's say I encrypt my identity, put it in, I put my compliance hash in there, and then a regulatory event happens. So the regulator goes to the exchange, and they say, oh, okay, well, go talk to these guys. They got the pre-image, and actually here's the DID, and here's who authenticated it. This is the person, and there's cryptographic evidence that they signed this, right? So on the outside, though, can you reverse a hash? No. And can you decrypt something, like AES encrypted thing? No. So from the outside, it's just some metadata junk that's connected to the transaction. So the parties who aren't involved would just look at this as noise and a normal Bitcoin-style transaction. So I think that's probably the most graceful, flexible way to introduce regulation into a chain, and then you're pushing a lot of the complex stuff off-chain to trusted third parties, and then you allow people to basically decide what their root of trust is, how they're going to authenticate DIDs, and allow people to decide what their compliance scheme happens to be. But yet, once you've decided that, you get auditability, immutability, and timestamping. Plus, you have the power of smart contracts, so you can put things in that say, this transaction will only settle if certain things are present. So if you actually get the money, you automatically know as a business that they're already in full compliance with your compliance scheme. No compliance officer required. So that's how we tend to look at these things. In application, there's a lot you still have to think about and layers you still have to build. But the good news is this is a tremendously industry-centric problem. Everybody's working on it. Sovereign, Indy, you guys are doing great work. So it's basically just learn from the best and take the best ideas and put them together into a solution that's layerable, and you can actually be very modular with it.
So in other words, keep the privacy and still be compliant.
Exactly, and also have enough flexibility that you can comply with multiple standards, because you can just simply add arbitrary amounts of hashes, right? And each of those can correspond to some pre-image that has additional data about that transaction. Then the regulator can get involved, and instead of the discussion of the regulator being like, oh, please change your laws, you're saying, how do we mechanize your laws? How do we write your regulations in a way that's machine understandable so that we can look at this as a library? Then we can base compliance contracts on that. So you can say, oh, okay, well, here's the US compliance standard. Here's the European compliance standard for this type of asset, for this type of actor in this particular type of jurisdiction. Then you put that into the address structure or into the transaction itself. And then the only way it settles is if you comply with it. And if you don't comply with it, the transaction doesn't settle. So I, as the merchant or the user, I never receive an unlawful transaction. And it's kind of like a contract. And if the regulator comes to me, I say, well, here's my proof that I followed the regulation. You approved this library. You said this is the legal standard. And the industry as a whole got together and wrote it with you. So I think that's the way to go. But it takes a long time to get there.
Yeah, that was my next question.
Yeah.
How far down the road are we before we get this kind of reasonably resolved?
Well, I mean, it's always an ebb and flow. So first they ignored us. I remember being in the early days of Bitcoin. No one gave a shit about us as an industry. We were able to buy Bitcoin using PayPal and eBay and trade it on forums, and it's didn't somehow violate the EULA. That was great. Then they got really concerned about things, and they said, oh, this Silk Road thing is bad. And we say, well, yeah, it is bad, isn't it? We should probably do something about that. So anyway, then they got really serious about it, and they said, well, how the hell do we actually regulate and tax these things, and should we give these people bank accounts? Those were the terrible 13s. And then we kind of grew out of that, and then eventually a global conversation started with the G8 and the FATF regulations and recommendations and so forth. And basically we're starting to get to a point where there's now a dialogue on an international basis, and there's like these two competing factors. One is the desire to try to replicate all of the good stuff or the stuff governments like from the legacy system. At the same time, the desire to avoid regulatory arbitrage. What they don't want to do is create standards where only a subset of the jurisdictions comply and the ones that don't get all the money in business. So they're trying to kind of balance all of this and at the same time say, hey, algorithmic law is really cool. Hey, automated regulation is really cool. Hey, we'd like some certainty as businesses without having to hire expensive New York lawyers and pay them $250,000 to say maybe. So how do we balance all these things out? So we're in the great balancing, in the great dialogue, and it'll probably take about 3 to 5 years to get through it. The problem is that while cryptography can do a lot of this for us, the protocols are incredibly complicated. My organization, your organization, we've both hired tremendously skilled cryptographers who have decades of experience, and they actually implement, vet these protocols, and roll them out and explain them. It does take several years. So I think just working through the tech alone will be 3 to 5 years, and then there'll probably be another 5 or 10 years of global conversations balancing those two things, the desire for what they already have and the desire to avoid regulatory arbitrage, and of course, maximizing revenue. You got to pay your taxes, and that's always a big part of this as well.
And I guess that's part of the complexity is kind of the tremendous difficult coding, explaining that, how it works, and convincing the regulators that it actually does work.
Right. Yeah, it's really hard to go to a guy who went to law school or got an MBA to say, hey, here's all this math. Yeah. You're like, please read the paper. And it's like, yeah, okay, good luck with that. Yeah.
So who should undertake that dialogue with the authorities? I mean, who do you see doing that in the future? Because it's not going to do itself, right?
Yeah, I think actually the best carrier of that message is not the business sector or private citizens, but rather small governments. So what we've noticed is a lot of very small jurisdictions which are still geopolitically relevant. For example, Switzerland, it's a small country, but it has a large amount of pull relative to its population. Liechtenstein, Singapore, Barbados, these jurisdictions are kind of leading the way. And they're creating already, in the absence of clarity, their own regulations, which are very different from the normal Western standards. And what will happen is strength in numbers will occur. So these countries will start saying, well, if you're staying within our borders or you're doing cross-border settlement between these countries, use this alternative thing. And this is especially interesting when you're looking at things like a Pan-African view or a Pan-Asian view, where there's this enormous economic growth, and actually they're starting to trade with each other, not just others. So if you're talking about doing business with 1 billion customers within Africa, you could use a completely alternative regulatory standard than the US standard, the EU standard, or the Chinese standard. And there is where I think the most progress will be made on the regulatory side. Then these governments collectively will go to the Western world and say, hey, we have 3 billion customers for you. If you become interoperable with us, you can actually do business with them the way we do business at 3 orders of magnitude less cost. Would you like to do that? And money talks. So I think that's probably the best way to propagate sensible market-oriented regulation is through innovating within the developing world. I'm a bit skeptical of trying to lobby and change regulation. I tried to do that with the Ron Paul movement. We tried the audit the Fed. We had almost every congressman sign on to that. We still didn't pull it off. And it just shows you how hard it is to do basic things like an audit inside a well-established jurisdiction. And frankly, most regulations in the Western world are defensive, and they're built to basically be anti-competitive. So these big guys get together and they say, hey, let's write it in a way that no competition can ever compete with us because they need $200 million as a ticket of admission just to even try. You know, and then the new guys that come in are not guys you want to take over either, like the Googles and the Apples and the Microsofts. They're bringing a kind of a different set of evils with them to compare with the banks. So you're never going to make any progress there going and pleading with Goldman Sachs to be nice. No. Instead, you have to approach it from create an economic incentive for the world to go in the direction that you want to go in, and then just go do that and wake up 10 years and the world's gone there.
Understood. So we have about 2 minutes left, and I was wondering if you have any questions from the floor.
Come on, guys.
Yeah, in front.
So Ricardo with Capital. I was wondering if you
Yeah, Trevor.
That's a great title.
Yeah, it's interesting stuff, right? Trevor's a great guy. You know, he used to be a hockey player. He played for the Rangers. So Polymesh is an interesting concept. So Polymath is like the workshop that creates security tokens. But the problem is it doesn't have a good environment to put those tokens in for trading and for the demands of a security token environment. You need certain privacy, you need certain performance, you need a certain way that assets have to move between each other, especially for the regulatory locking. And when you try to do that in Ethereum, it's just like a roadmap to hell. It just doesn't work. Ethereum wasn't built for something like that. So the point of Polymesh is to say, can they build a special purpose environment where you can create an asset, let's say with Poly, and then move that into that environment, and then at the very least, that asset can then be managed with that environment and perhaps one day get connected to liquidity. So where we're currently at is in kind of the proof of concept and prototyping phase, where we looked at a lot of different technologies, and I gave some recommendations on how to build a 1.0 product, and they're now actually executing on a roadmap to build a demo and actually show that to the world. And then the hope is that they can get some traction, get partners to come in and actually make Polymesh very useful for that special purpose. This is where the Charles Hoskinson consultant sometimes conflicts with Charles Hoskinson, the CEO of IOHK and the guy who runs Cardano, because we think a lot about security tokens with Cardano, and that may be at times a different philosophy and strategy than what Poly. So as a consultant, I advise them and I give them my best effort, and it's of course their decision of what direction they want to go in and what they want to do. That said, it's a very exciting project, and it was really eye-opening for me to see that even basic things like cross-border settlement of securities is not settled, which is crazy if you think about it. We live in these global markets, and everybody's regulation is kind of the same in this respect. So why the hell is this still a difficult topic? But it's a lot of fun, and they're a cool team. Trevor's a good guy, and I really love the rest of the people there. Yes?
Just one last question, because we have no time left.
Guido. You know, he once tried to buy land in Kosovo back in the 90s.
Before I joined blockchain ecosystem, what are the three best blockchains next to Cardano blockchain where you see a future in our ecosystem? Because I think it will not be one blockchain in the future.
Oh, yeah, that's very easy. So the three best are obviously Cardano. As you said, actually not Cardano. Okay, so that's simple. So there's one that we're building that we can't announce yet, so that's really awesome. Ethereum Classic is obviously very awesome, right? Because we were involved with that. No, but levity aside, I don't tend to look at the top 3 or top 5. I do look at interesting projects. Like I really have a lot of admiration and respect for Algorand, and I think that they deserve a place at the table. And the team they've assembled is really world class. They have the best, if not some of the best, if not the best cryptographers around, who have invented most of the foundations our entire industry is built on. So they have to be taken seriously, and they're a very serious venture. I think Concordium is another one to pay enormous amounts of attention to, because KYC AML is just such a difficult problem, and it's one of the linchpins for liquidity for our entire industry and opening up the security token world. So that's super important. And then, I tend to look at a lot of boutique projects like Zen Protocol or IOTA or these things where they bring legitimately interesting and unique technology to bear. It may be incomplete and not quite where it needs to be, but it's still a great proof of concept for concepts that are very divergent from the normal way that you construct blockchain technology. And those are just great experiments that we can kind of learn from and do cool things with. I also have a lot of respect for Tezos. We've had our differences on Reddit and Twitter, but I'm pretty famous for having differences with people in Reddit and Twitter. That said, they're trying really creative things with governance. They use formal methods, and GoCaml is the sister language to Haskell. So there's a lot of good work that's being done there, and there's some very good people associated with those projects. So anybody who's doing those things, I always take seriously, and we love learning from them. It's part of that Darwinian soup that is our industry.
Thank you very much.
Thank you much.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Put your hands together for Charles.